Ladies and gentlemen, just as you take your seats, it is my great honour and privilege to introduce to you all to Professor John Gearson. John is the head of the School of Security Studies at King's College London. A Professor of National Security Studies, he's also Director of the Centre for Defence Studies within the Department of War Studies, and previously served as the Director of the Freeman Air and Space Institute between 2020 and 2022. Once more, one and all, my pleasure, John.
Well, thanks very much. And as the token Brit, along with my colleague Hugh Davis here, it was very interesting hearing the perspectives of our chaotic political and security system at the moment. 3 Prime Ministers in 3 months. It's quite a tally, actually. And we'll see if there's any more stability in the next 6 months. I'm very pleased to be here at the conference along with Hugh, and I think it shows the seriousness that the university puts on this Plus Alliance. I'm supposed to be running the biggest school in King's College on a daily basis, but this is deemed to be absolutely core business for us, and I hope it shows the commitment of my university to making Security and Defence Plus work. It's going to gather pace following this conference, of course, as we continue to focus on AUKUS delivery and growing challenges to global order, more broadly defined. There'll be lots of other topics in that area: climate change and security, economic warfare concepts. People don't like that term, but that is what it is to some extent, much neglected for several decades. Transformative technological change that we heard just before the lunch break, and more holistic approaches to security more generally. John Bew, the Prime Minister's Foreign Policy Advisor, was mentioned several times this morning. The most important thing, though, which wasn't mentioned, is that he's one of my professors. And I've got this thread, and I'm going to be sort of reeling him in, I hope, next year, back to the university, once he's finished the refresh to the integrated review that the British are undertaking at the moment. One other thing I wanted to say was that whilst the Ukraine invasion, because that's what it is, has had an extraordinary effect on almost all aspects of the British security and defence community, from my perspective, it's actually strengthened the determination of the officials I speak to deliver on AUKUS, rather than the opposite that was discussed this morning. And that's because the broader national security approach that my country's been sort of trying to deliver over the last 12 years emphasises this need to have a joined-up policy to these various challenges. And that's epitomised by John Bew's work in Parliament, of course, our bureaucracies working closer together and understanding the connections between various areas. So this panel on defence and diplomatic opportunities will discuss a very broad and challenging area. Our 3 speakers are well qualified to guide us into these challenges. I'll refer you to the full bios in the conference packs, but I'd like to introduce them all and give the panelists time to present their ideas before we have a conversation, an exchange, and some Q&A. So starting with Dr. Michael Green, who is Chief Executive Officer of the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Previously, Dr. Green was a Senior Vice President for Asia, Japan Chair, and Henry A. Kissinger Chair at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, and Director of the Asian Studies and a Chair in Modern and Contemporary Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at Georgetown. He previously served on the staff of the National Security Council from 2001 to 2005, and acted as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Asia, with responsibility for East Asia and South Asia. Very intriguingly, and I must talk to him about this after the panel, he's won international prizes on the Great Highland Bagpipe, which I was very pleased to read about. Our second speaker is Ambassador Joe Hockey, a founding partner of Bondi Partners. Ambassador Hockey served as Australia's ambassador to the United States, taking up his post in January 2016, and was responsible for Australia's relationship with the US during the final years of the Obama administration. At Bondi Partners, Ambassador Hockey spearheads the firm's strategic direction in both the US and Australia. He previously, as the elected Treasurer of Australia, was responsible for all aspects of the Australian economy, a big subject in Britain at the moment, funnily enough, with a big thing coming out very, very soon. I was intrigued to read that he chaired the highly successful G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meetings in 2014, and of course we're seeing perhaps a less successful iteration of that taking place at the moment. And Senator James Paterson, who is a Liberal senator for Victoria, was elected in March 2016 as one of the youngest Liberals ever elected to Senate. He was appointed Shadow Minister for Cybersecurity and the Shadow Minister for Countering Foreign Interference by Opposition Leader Peter Dutton. As the chair the earlier chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security from February 2021 until May 2022, Senator Paterson oversaw a record high workload in response to Australia's changing security environment, handing down 23 reports on Australia's national security in just 12 months. I hope Senator Paterson won't mind me noting that I'm a former staffer of the British Parliament's Defence Committee on secondment from King's, and this record suggests to me superb leadership by the Senator and a very busy staff, or maybe a much larger staff than I had when I was at the Defence Committee. So that's our panel this morning. Each panelist will make some opening remarks, and then we'll go to questions from the floor. If I can ask our first speaker. Thank you. Mike.
I want to thank you for the introduction, Sean. I want to thank the British people and the Tory party for making American politics look almost tolerable. Thank you for that. We all do our bit. AUKUS is a partnership. I'm not going to play bagpipes. It didn't pay the bills, so I'm here talking about national security instead. I guess behind every foreign policy expert is a frustrated musician or French literature expert paying their way otherwise. I am playing with the Sydney-based pipe band, and we lost recently in the Nationals to Melbourne. I'm discovering since moving here in August that Sydney loses to Melbourne in a lot of things, except as someone pointed out, the weather. I'm going to come back actually to American politics and AUKUS. I think it's relevant, and the recent midterm election, if you've seen my musings on it, is actually good for AUKUS and important. But our topic for the panel is the geopolitics and diplomatic and defense opportunities. AUKUS is primarily a technology agreement to develop capabilities. It is not a security treaty like ANZUS or the US-Japan Security Treaty or NATO. But in some ways, it has all the significance in historical context of exactly that. The operational and deterrence impact of 8 to 10 new boats maintaining what is already, by most experts, estimate a 15-year undersea advantage over the PLA Navy is in itself very significant in terms of deterrence capabilities. It essentially reverses the momentum. The PLA Navy has been pushing out to the first, second island chain, the Pacific Islands, Indian Ocean. This backfoots them and reverses momentum and complicates PLA military planning. It's also, however, very geopolitically significant in terms of the dissuasion messages that it sends to Beijing and other potential aggressors. The Pentagon doesn't use this phrase anymore. They did when I worked in the Pentagon. There used to be a tendency to differentiate between deterrence and dissuasion. Deterrence was about warfighting and imposing defeat on anyone who attacks you. Dissuasion is more about making them think twice about the broader consequences of aggression. And I think while the capabilities building is primarily about deterrence capabilities and effects, it has important dissuasion effects. It will complicate strategic assumptions behind any use of force in the Indo-Pacific region by any potential adversary. First, it gets in the way of sea lanes of communication. China imports 80% of its oil. It's the largest importer of oil and gas. The Baker Institute in Texas recently put out a report, contrary to what you'd expect after Ukraine and sanctions, that China's dependence on seaborne shipments of oil and gas for its economy are actually going to go up over the next decade, not down. So it complicates Chinese assumptions about the broader implications of the use of force. alignment. Now, AUKUS represents an alignment and a significant commitment of maritime democracies, although the governments won't state it, because of the deteriorating security situation, which is largely about Chinese behavior and capabilities. And it's worth thinking for a moment where we are historically. And I hope my friends from the UK won't mind me saying, but imagine a decade ago, and I believe at that time Osborne was Chancellor of the Exchequer and was going around describing London as the renminbi capital of Europe. In the United States 10 years ago, the Obama administration was debating whether or not to accept Xi Jinping's proposal for a so-called Xinjiang Daguo Guanxi, new model of great power relations. The idea that to avoid conflict, the great powers, the US and China, would settle all disputes in the region. And the small powers, or the middle powers, Australia, Japan, India, Korea, Indonesia, Britain, all the rest of them, would not be involved. And of course, to settle the problems, the US would have to back away from commitments to traditional allies, the Taiwan Relations Act and so forth. And there was serious consideration in the Obama administration, public statements of support for this idea. It was being debated. And a decade ago, if you looked at Lowy polls about Australian views of China versus the US, if you're American, they were not pretty. So imagine AUKUS 10 years ago. You can't. What it reflects and what it signals to Zhongnanhai and Beijing is the consequences of coercive behavior against all these maritime powers and against the region. And that signaling effect is very important. It does not mean for a minute, particularly if you saw the 20th Party Congress, that Xi Jinping is going to say, guys, we've been a little harsh on the Australians, been a little tough on Taiwan and the Europeans, let's back off. It does not mean that. I think what you saw in the 20th Party Congress is what you'll get from Xi Jinping's China, which is one of the fundamental strategic assumptions behind this massive investment. And I think AUKUS also demonstrates the willpower of three maritime democracies to defend the maritime commons and the maritime domain from coercion. And you can see it in polls we just did at the U.S. Studies Center. We asked a month ago, and it's on our website, about security issues, about AUKUS, about trade. The majority of Americans and Australians think our stance towards China is right. 20% of Australians said it's too tough, 4% of Americans. But the vast majority thought it was either too hard. So let me do that again. 20% of Australians said it was too tough on China. 4% of Americans said our current stance is too tough on China. So reversing that, significant majorities thought in Australia and the US that how we are handling the China challenge is either not tough enough or about right. Support for AUKUS is high, 52% in Australia, I think, about that in the US. Opposition is about a third of support in both countries. Support for alliances is very high. We asked the question, does the alliance with Australia make the United States safer? We asked that of the American public. And we asked 2 years ago before it was at the center, and 48% of Americans said the alliance with Australia makes us safer. Americans generally support alliances because they think it's in our interest to defend our friends and allies. So we asked the question, well, what about us? Does it make the United States safer? 2 years ago, 48% said yes. A month ago, 60% said yes. What that tells you is Americans know we need allies. It's a dangerous world. They can see that in Ukraine. And let me just end by briefly touching on two things. First, the midterm elections. This is, on balance, I think, a good result for AUKUS. And the reason I say that is Democrats maintain control of the Senate, and Republicans have only a very narrow margin, it appears, we don't know yet, in the House. So President Biden is not going to be poleaxed. They're going to attack him, but he's not going to be blocked in the Senate. There's very strong bipartisan consensus about China strategy, about AUKUS, about alliances in the Indo-Pacific, in both sides of the aisles in the Congress. But what you get with a small Republican minority is committee chairs for armed services and other committees who always spend more on defense when they come into power. There's a reason stock prices for defense stocks go up when Republicans win the House. They always spend more on defense, and they're going to press on the issues that are difficult on AUKUS. So one of the toughest things is ITAR and export controls. That's largely the domain of the left in American politics. The Republican House is going to press on those issues. So it's just enough of a victory to get new leadership and committee chairs that will ask hard questions of the administration. Many in the administration working on AUKUS will welcome those questions, but not such a large victory that the Biden administration is crippled, and that's good. Very last thing, since we're talking about geopolitics, Southeast Asia, the narratives about AUKUS, it's pretty clear what Beijing wants the narratives to be, which is AUKUS violates the IAEA, and the head of the NPT, and the head of the IAEA has said it does not. And then I think you'll find Chinese diplomats are pushing hard for Shan-Fizz and Spin-Fizz and other nuclear-free agreements to try to make hay of this, to impose costs on us. I don't think we should panic over that. I think if you're Indonesia or if you're Malaysia, there's no price for your foreign ministry to come out and say they're very concerned about AUKUS. No price at all. But when you talk to defense ministries across Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, they completely understand the logic of restoring a favorable balance of power because the PLA Navy's in the Natuna Sea. It's in the Philippine Sea. And I think they get it. So we need to be very attentive, I think, to the Southeast Asian narrative, but we shouldn't do things different than we would do without AUKUS. It's mainly about engaging and proving we are a more reliable security partner. So with that, I look forward to my fellow panelists' comments. Thank you.
Well, it's great to be back at the National Press Club. Much friendlier reception than the last time I came here, I must say. Well, good to see you and to be amongst such an honoured group of people. I see AUKUS as a commercial agreement between very close allies. It's not a security agreement. Let's not kid ourselves. It's not a guarantee that each country will come to the support of others in a time of conflict. AUKUS is a long-term commitment by 3 countries to share innovation and technology across at least 17 different headline technologies, 9 in areas relating to nuclear submarines, and 8 in other fields such as AI and cyber. All AUKUS work requires each country to coordinate across their own governments and agencies in a way that fair commentary would suggest is somewhere between unachievable and impossible. For example, the newly divided US Congress will need to approve changes that support the coordinated efforts of 3 separate departments, at least 3 agencies, and at least the US Navy, if not all the American armed services. So you're getting an understanding when I say near impossible. And that's just the United States. The success of AUKUS and its defeat of systemic opposition will be driven by the collective desire to build a national security platform that can compete and defeat adversaries. Equally importantly, we will build the technology that sends a message to our potential adversaries that we are not to be messed with. The February invasion of Ukraine was a failure of deterrence. After the Russian annexation of Crimea back in 2014, you would think that Europe in particular would have stepped up its investment in national security. Instead, countries like France and Germany wanted to be mediators between Russia and Ukraine. Well, that went well, didn't it? You'd think the 2 countries, France and Germany, would have learnt the historic lessons associated with appeasement. I really wonder if those lessons have had any impact at all. As of today, the United States has spent more money helping to defend Ukraine than the whole of Europe combined. In fact, if you take out the contributions of the United Kingdom and Poland, the contributions of the rest of Europe are less than 20% of the contribution of the United States. That's politically unsustainable in the United States, no matter who controls the Congress next year. So technology and money have made a huge difference in the defence of Ukraine, and both, of course, will be needed on a much larger scale if we are to support Taiwan. I note many think tanks are modelling potential conflicts all the time. Few are modelling the money required for those scenarios. I doubt any have modelled how the money will be sourced. So the ambitions of AUKUS can be undermined by the unaffordable ambitions of the hundreds of people working away on its programs. I have no doubt that the technology associated with AUKUS will work. I think that the bureaucratic red tape can be overcome, even if that makes heroic assumptions about the removal or amendment of ITAR, the streamlining of decision-making and the burying of generations of egos. We can also overcome the raft of new guidelines and rules that transcend the political boundaries in the UK, US and Australia. However, I am not sure that in the absence of kinetic engagement, we can fund our AUKUS ambitions. Australia will have to contribute more money in real terms to AUKUS and its ambitions than the United States and the United Kingdom, because Pillar 1 of AUKUS involves Australia building and acquiring our own fleet of submarines. There is a compelling case for the submarine program to have an entirely separate funding and expenditure profile in the Commonwealth budget. Even so, there will be a funding gap between our ambitions for AUKUS and our deliverables. Submarines are just the beginning. There is nothing off the shelf about AI, quantum, cyber, space, or any other national security priority that allows us to meet uniquely Australian needs. The government alone will not be able to meet those spending demands. It will take private sector investment on a scale previously not seen outside of war to meet the technology and production needs of AUKUS. When the private sector builds and funds technology, it has the capacity to not only to sell that technology to other governments, but in the case of AI or quantum or cyber, the private sector has commercial opportunities that make the solution more affordable for government. Dual-purpose technology works, and it's funded, and it's affordable. But all of that requires private capital. Unlike the United States and the United Kingdom, which have deep and sophisticated capital markets that support long-standing investment in defence industry, Australia has a very long way to go. Our challenge is that most Australian defence companies are one-client companies, the Australian government. That makes Australian defence industry an almost unbackable investment class. Now, despite this, in partnership with Elliston Capital, my firm Bondi Partners has established Australia's first national security investment fund called the 1941 Fund. We have raised capital from investors in Australia and the United States. We have started deploying that capital after having analysed over 250 companies operating in Australia, the US, the UK, Canada and Israel. We have working relationships with the CIA's INQTEL and the CSIRO's main sequence. We are Australian pioneers, but it has been a difficult road. For us, it was impossible to do a first raise and at the same time engage an enormous amount of effort to educate the market about the investment profile of national security. Australian defence contractors also have their own legacy challenges. The biggest Australian defence contractor is the ASC, and it is still government-owned. Other Australian primes are either overly reliant on single contracts or they are controlled by smart entrepreneurial founders that struggle to support diversification. Australian primes do not have the diversity of clients or products like a Lockheed or a Boeing that cut across many governments with both military and civilian applications. So our ability here in Australia to raise capital is severely hamstrung. In addition, to meet ever-growing demand, Australian defence contractors haven't got the access to capital or patient and well-informed investors that can meet the market. This can be overcome, but it will take time and effort. And you need a track record of successful investment. Finally, politically, we have an economic environment that is not conducive to a massive increase in defence spending, notwithstanding the increased aggression of Russia and China. Central banks and inflation are sucking capital out of the global economy. a very determined policy to reduce the amount of money in the economy. And governments are inevitably going to have real spending cuts in essential community services like health, education and welfare over the next decade. The community will tolerate and conditionally support increased investment in national security, but not if there is a simple wealth transfer from Australian taxpayers to US and UK primes. It is essential that Australian defence spending is Australian money for Australian enterprise and innovation and Australian jobs. So, ladies and gentlemen, AUKUS simply won't work without new domestic private sector investment in the technologies that we need to defend our nation.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here this afternoon, and at the outset I really want to congratulate UNSW for the leadership it's shown in initiating this conference. If I was being a little bit cheeky, I might say that it's a pleasant change to see our universities thinking about how they can help the Australian Defence Forces instead of the People's Liberation Army. But on a serious point, it is absolutely essential to the delivery of AUKUS that we have a very good relationship between our university sector and the government. Both from the training and research point of view, we will not deliver AUKUS if it doesn't rely on a strong relationship between our universities and government. AUKUS can either be a game-changing opportunity for Australia and our ability to defend ourselves, and for our partners so that we can defend our shared values and our shared interests in the region, or it can be a beautiful ornament that sits on the shelf and gathers dust. And the difference as to which of those scenarios it's going to be is going to come down to political leadership and whether we can break through the very real obstacles that are in the pathway of the program. In my view, in these early stages of the agreement, the most important thing to do is to establish the institutional structures that will help steward this program through its many decades of delivery. And it will be a baton-passing exercise in a political sense. It was initiated under the Coalition. It is now the task of the Labor Party to take it forward, and at some point in the future it will again be the task of the Coalition. Selfishly, I hope that is soon. It might not be for some time, but either way, at some point in the future it will return to the Coalition and it will be our responsibility to manage it. So to scrutinise the very significant expenditure and the extremely consequential decisions to be made on capability and acquisitions, my view is we need very strong parliamentary oversight of that. It's also important that we have the opposition closely engaged and informed for when they do have that responsibility, again, of overseeing the program. Now, this is not a criticism of the new government in any way, shape or form. So far, the Defence Minister has been very generous in ensuring that we are being provided on an ad hoc basis briefings to keep us up to date with the development of the program, and I will be a beneficiary of one of those briefings in a week's time from Professor Smith and Sir Angus Houston on the interim Defence Strategic Review report. But we don't currently have the formal institutions in place to make sure that this happens on an institutionalised basis. One model which I think could work well is a parliamentary joint committee on AUKUS, along the same lines of the existing parliamentary joint committee on intelligence and security, which I chaired in the previous parliament. The committee would have the ability to receive regular classified briefings, have a security-cleared secretariat, and it would be able to examine classified documents. Like the PJCIS, it would deal with any legislation relating to AUKUS and help ensure it receives bipartisan support through the parliament. And like the PJCS, in my view, the committee should be of parties of government only, not independents or crossbenchers. It would also ensure that opposition politicians remain connected to and engage with the program and those officials who are managing it, just as the PJCS does for the intelligence community, so that when there is a change of government, there are frontbenchers who are ready to be sworn in as ministers who are already familiar with the major issues and the relevant portfolios that they will be assuming, as the PJCS has just done for this new government. It should also help underpin the very strong bipartisanship that is necessary for this critical national project over many decades. I know my friend and colleague Peter Khalil addressed you this morning. Peter and I have travelled to the United States 3 times this year, and I travelled once separately to the United Kingdom on AUKUS-related trips. And it would be much better if it wasn't the PJCIS informally fulfilling that role, but a dedicated AUKUS committee. It's not a new idea. My colleague, the now Shadow Minister for Defence, Andrew Hastie, has proposed a joint committee like the PJCS for defence issues in a different context, in the context of allegations of war crimes in Afghanistan. But in my view, what is at stake over the next decade is nothing less than whether or not we hand on to our children and grandchildren the liberal democracy that we inherited from our parents and our grandparents. And if this is such a consequential national endeavour, which I believe AUKUS is, then it must come with appropriate and matching oversight responsibilities. For my remaining time in public life in the Parliament, if the only thing that I achieve is to make sure that we deliver on the potential of AUKUS, then I'll consider that to be time well spent. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much indeed to all our speakers. I think we've had some sobering cold shower, some talk about a broader approach, and really interesting suggestions about oversight. And I'm thinking about it in the British context as well, where joint committees are rare, but in the intelligence world, we do have one with a similar remit. Before I hand over to the audience for questions, I wanted to raise something with you that I've commented to a few of my colleagues on the Plus Alliance, and I'd just be interested in your opinion or comment on, which is that in the last, well, since AUKUS was announced actually, but especially since the invasion of Ukraine, visiting delegations from, oh, be careful, I won't say where from, but from countries in the region who I suppose we would say are broadly allied, quite shocked a number of Europeans by constantly referring to the special military operation going on in Ukraine. And they didn't use the language of invasion at all. And whilst I don't want to talk about European security, this, to me, said something quite significant about the power relationships and perhaps the link between China and Russia, even playing out in the politics of what I expected to be quite friendly nations when they were visiting us. I just wondered if this rings true or what you might say about it.
Yes, it does ring true, and it highlights the challenges that we have in this region in particular, which is that not all the states in this region are ideologically or values-based alignment with Australia and the United States and the United Kingdom. And if we are to win them over and win them to our side, there's an enormous amount of effort that has to happen. We certainly shouldn't assume that it will just be the case. To Ambassador Hockey's point on technology, right now, a lot of these states, which I think it'd be fair to term as swing states, are contemplating, do they go in a bifurcated technological world with the Chinese model of technological governance and development and with Chinese suppliers, or do they go with Western suppliers? And at the moment, in making those choices, they face, very significant inducement and encouragement, both overt and covert, to take the Chinese road rather than the Western road. And that will have profound implications for us, not just for our citizens who seek to travel and do business in those countries, but for giving China a significant amount of leverage over those states when it comes to future conflict in the region. So I think there's nothing more urgent than making sure we're putting our shoulders to the wheel to help guide those choices in a way that supports the sovereignty and self-determination of those countries.
I agree with the Senator. I've done polling over the years at CSIS and here now at the U.S. Study Center, and these polls show very clearly that the same countries you're talking about, when you ask either elites or the average citizens what's the best form of government, overwhelmingly they prefer a democratic form of government with good governance and so forth. So it's not like the Chinese system is winning on charisma or attraction. You also see in polls we've done in the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies a consistent downward trajectory in terms of views of China across the region, worried about China. But what's also happening, which contradicts that trend, is that Russia and China at an official level do what our diplomats don't do, which is punish officials, punish journalists who don't use their narrative. And both of them, and they learn from each other, the Chinese and Russians on this, through social media, and the Senator is an expert on this, ensure their narrative is getting through. And in the global South, there is some receptivity to that. So it's worrisome and it merits attention, but in my view, and I don't know if the Senator or the Ambassador agree, in my view, it doesn't mean we're losing Southeast Asia. It just means the game is on, and we just need to step up.
Okay, thanks. So one more on this, and then I'll move on. Almost every speaker this morning referred to the rules-based international system, but in a kind of trajectory from this, is this profoundly a, let's call it broadly defined, a Western concept? Because we're having quite a debate in Europe about whether what our foreign ministries and our diplomats are saying isn't actually agreed with by the world. They're not necessarily following, as you say, the model of authoritarian regimes, but there does seem to be this transition where a number of states don't necessarily share our vision of what we've had before with a few tweaks to make you feel better, which seems to be the critique of constantly talking about a rules-based international system. And I wonder if that could be a danger for AUKUS in moving forward, when we talk about it in broader terms than military technical, as we've been discussing today.
I think every state in the UN at least has a tacit or rhetorical commitment to those values. Whether it's a sincere and genuine one is a different question, but if you look at the UN Charter or the UN Declaration on Human Rights or the rules of the World Trade Organization, you can't be a member of those bodies without signing up to them, and indeed China is officially aspires to those values even if it doesn't deliver them. Our challenge is holding them to their word. I think terminology like international rules-based order is not a very attractive set of descriptors. Either domestically here in Australia it means nothing to most Australians, or internationally it's a fairly meaningless concept. I think what we should be aiming for is the end state which we desire, the sovereignty and self-determination of states and their freedom to determine their own trajectory. They're the things that most people I think have a better understanding of, and certainly it resonates in a region which is not replete with liberal democracies and which has regimes which we have to work with, which have a different value set to our own.
If I could add, I think we have some challenges, not insurmountable. I was struck about a year or so ago after a G-Summit meeting where the principals, the foreign ministers, the Secretary of State from the G7 countries stood at a distance from each other because of COVID. You may remember the photo. And the United Front Department, the People's Daily and Global Times in China, put out the same photo but photoshopped so that the Americans were U.S. Marines from the Boxer Rebellion, the Brits were Royal Marines from the Boxer Rebellion, the Japanese Army from the Boxer Rebellion, and basically saying, this G7, these are the imperialists, the Western imperialists. It was very effective and clever propaganda. And our problem is when we've tried to democratize the institutions, like with the G20, to make them more inclusive of new economic powers like China, India, and Brazil, and South Africa, the problem is they don't work then. They cease to be effective. And so we're once again finding the most effective international groupings are the G7 and so forth. So that's a bit of a dilemma for us. But I think where the senator is heading is the right way to think about it. We also, by the way, have the problem the U.S. has been inactive in the WTO, pulled out of the TPP and so forth. But if you talk about it in terms of data reciprocity, is it okay for a country like China to take in data and then do with it whatever they want? Are economic embargoes like Beijing has done against Australia and Korea and the Philippines and others, is that okay? So if you frame it in those terms, I think the vast majority, even of the so-called global South, would agree. So it is largely about how we frame it, and the senator may be right. Rules-based order may not be the right language for us.
I mean, you mentioned the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, at the beginning. I mean, I think for us in Europe, especially in Britain, there was a dramatic transformation pretty much around the 5G and Huawei discussion. But I was personally present at occasions where security chiefs in Britain were vehemently disagreeing with their American allies, and it politically changed very fast, and it wasn't the change of prime minister alone. I mean, something happened in that period which was very significant, and I doubt if AUKUS would have been possible without that change. So in policy terms, there was more to the sudden appearance that we were told of AUKUS earlier.
Well, I can tell you what changed. The Americans said they'd stop sharing information with the UK if it went down the road with Huawei. Boom.
I think we won't debate it.
We put it more politely than that, I think.
Yeah,
but
okay.
There was just perception.
Short form. There's the failure of a failed diplomat. But short form words, that's exactly what they said.
Let's take some questions from the audience, please. Who'd like to go first? Peter. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't want to monopolise questions, but it's just too much fun. So my question to Joe is, so when does the Australian government sort of start to max out how much it thinks it can reasonably spend on defence? I mean, Anthony Albanese's now said whatever it takes, whatever that means. I'm reminded of Hugh White's book, How to Defend Australia, where he very briefly said, well, we could maybe, in extremis under threat, think about possibly 4% of gross national product. And then the next paragraph said, or we could just give up. So, you know, are we at that point, Joe? And then for the others, and John, you might want to offer a thought on this as well. So James has talked about an AUKUS-specific parliamentary committee. There's the AUKUS caucus in the US. Is there any value in thinking about some sort of three-country committee system that more formally gets together to sort of sustain that type of knowledge and energy and enthusiasm at the legislative level across the three countries?
So good question, Peter. On the defence budget, so Tony Abbott, when we were elected, pledged to increase defence expenditure and reduce the deficit. And the challenge is that a lot of the budget is locked in programs, Medicare or welfare and so on. So you don't have a lot of discretion in reducing it, you know, the discretionary expenditure other than foreign aid and defence. So you can cut programs in defence, you don't need to take it to Parliament. You can cut foreign aid, you don't need to take it to Parliament. If you want to cut welfare or health or something, you have to take it to Parliament. So if you are going, and you know, basically the economic conditions now are saying to governments, as we've just learnt in the UK, you know, you can't keep spending. And this day of reckoning was always going to come, and I warned about it. It is coming now because they cannot control inflation. Despite all the bravado, inflation's locked in well above 2 to 3%. Net result is there'll be tremendous pressure on governments to either massively increase tax or to decrease expenditure. If you increase tax, you slow your economy. So it becomes self-defeating in a deteriorating economic environment. So therefore, what would give you the moral authority to increase defence expenditure? It is a threat. And the question is, how big is that threat? The danger is, for Australia, that we end up like the UK, that your defence expenditure is so locked in to 2 or 3 big programs. In the case of the UK, it was the Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers, right? And dominated their budget. And George Osborne, who's a mate of mine, you know, he's going, let's have another one, and let's do this, and let's commit to that. And of course, it dominated the budget and squeezed out everything else. So this is where I come back. Australia has a pool of capital that is the envy of the world, right? $3-4 trillion in superannuation. But a lot of those superannuation funds won't touch defence and national security because of ESG. But if you say to them, oh, you go and invest in the indexes in the United States, they'll invest in Boeing and Lockheed and all the others. But they won't. If you go to them and say, please invest in, you know, Austal or someone, you know, if CEA were listed CEA, they'll go, well, hang on, we've got these ESG issues. So when I raised my fund for national security, I went to high net worth individuals, combined value $70 billion, maybe $100 billion. I said to them, patriotism, but also to the US investors, I said, this is good for the US. And that's how we raised the money, and that's how we're deploying the money. If that gap isn't filled, Australia's going to fall behind. Australia can't do 4% of GDP. The UK couldn't do 3% of GDP. The US can do a significant increase in defence expenditure as it did during the 1960s, during peacetime, even before the Vietnam War. They can do it because they have a currency that the world goes to. You speak to congressmen about fiscal rectitude? Nah, doesn't matter. In fact, this year, the interest bill on US government debt is going to exceed the defence budget for the first time. Just the interest on US government debt is going to be bigger than the $840 billion a year they spend on defence, which is bigger than the next 10 countries combined. So the US is not the issue. The UK, God bless you, you're not the issue. But for us, how do we do it? And there's only one way to do it. You've got to have private sector money come in. And there's a lot of work to be done before that really starts to flow.
Peter, to your second point, yes, I think structures like that are going to be necessary because I am concerned in the absence of meaningful legislative reform in each of the three jurisdictions that AUKUS is going to be ITAR'd to death or insert your other, bureaucratic obstacle to death. And the idea that if each individual component of a nuclear submarine, let alone each individual advanced capability under the second pillar of AUKUS, is going to have to get individualised approvals at every point during the system, whether it's intellectual property or arms control or whatever, then it's just not going to work. And it's not going to work on the timelines that we need it to work, given how urgent the strategic environment is. So, yes, I think some kind of reform like that is going to be necessary, and it's going to have to be done with all three member countries and their legislatures deeply involved.
Sorry, just to add one point to that, the bipartisanship is really important. It's very strong, Mike, as you know, in the United States, where there is an AUKUS caucus, effectively. James is right. Here, it's really important. The UK, doesn't appear to be any bipartisan parliamentary group on AUKUS. I might be wrong. No. So there might be an opportunity there for us to stimulate that sort of initiative, particularly given the Labor Party in the UK has traditionally been more reticent. I don't want to get into politics, but at the National Press Club. So.
You're pressing me. Can I just say, I think George Osborne and Cameron confirmed the carriers because the contracts were so expensive to cancel by that stage, and they didn't actually put them in train. That was the preceding government. But I think some of the aircraft are quite expensive as well, which are going on them. But on the point about
on the Elizabeths.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the JSFs are the big spend actually. But on the politics of it, I mean, I think I do think there's a sort of technical side for joint parliamentary committees, but actually, on that last point, I'd see it more as something like, maybe the Western European Union parliamentary branch, which was very good at actually explaining things to the other members of their legislatures and the public ultimately. And that would be another purpose of it, I think. It should hopefully be a relatively big one with delegates who could actually be the voice of AUKUS, which would really help. And I would say that generally, there is agreement on national security and defence. I mean, it was only changed with Jeremy Corbyn's time as opposition leader, really. It doesn't mean there couldn't be changes. I think for us, the interesting question is, we'll find out in 2 days, does our defence secretary resign when he's told he's going down to 2%? Or will the Prime Minister take the view, which I think he will, he can't have any more resignations ready, because then you'll start looking like the last Prime Minister, and she lasted how many days? So, I think probably they'll manage to keep 2.5%, 2.4%, but yes, the days of 3%, they were 47 days of 3%, and that's lost. But I don't think in the context of Ukraine, you really can actually argue for reducing defence spending just now. So they'll probably be okay for the moment.
Well, on the AUKUS caucus, I had a series of dinners with a bipartisan group of about 10 Republican and Democratic senators interested in AUKUS, interested in Indo-Pacific security, and they, on their own, were enthusiastically talking about exactly this, some kind of trilateral parliamentary grouping. But I would lean more in the way you describe it. I think oversight, it would probably be too much. I'm trying to imagine you having subpoena power to call in the chief of the U.S. Navy, for example, which I would pay to see. That would be so it would not truly be joint, but the public messaging and the disciplining of the bureaucracy and then educating other members would be the most important part. And I think you'd find enthusiasm in the U.S. on that. I also think on Joe's point about private capital, I assume you're talking more about the advanced capabilities piece or also the submarine? Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, the debate, so I've been here 3 months, a lot of the debate about advanced capabilities I've heard, and maybe my sample size is wrong, is about how Australia gets inside the program of record. How does Australia get access to advanced Pentagon capability building efforts? But that's not the debate in the U.S. among the people who are really thinking about advanced capabilities, former Defense Secretary Bob Gates and Michelle Thorne and others, they want to get away from the program of record. What they want to do is find a way to tap Silicon Valley and not have, my dad was a colonel, so I say this with respect, a lot of colonels setting requirements, but find a more, you know, and that is not something we have done. But to Joe's point, enormous potential to really to exponentially increase the capabilities we can field because of the private sector capital we can muster.
We've just had 2 big cyber attacks in Australia. Without government involvement, there's going to be further cyber attacks on that scale. The best hope of resisting those cyber attacks is some sort of engagement with government. That is where an AUKUS comes into play, because some of the experiences and, you know, the work of the NSA and others, some of that, you know, experienced, knowledge-based secondees coming to Australia and helping us to build the defence mechanisms. And then you'll start to get the private sector to stump up money to help with that defence mechanism. But the AUKUS should be a framework for facilitating that sort of engagement. And that's when AUKUS really will work. There is.
Oh, good, thanks. Yeah, fascinating stuff, but I wanted to go to some of the stresses that might be there and wonder what people's response will be. Because we're going through that exercise. What you say about defence is absolutely right. It's a movable feast and almost nothing else is. And so therefore, capabilities will have to be developed within what is already being spent in defence. And I think one of the biggest problems we're going to have with AUKUS and defence is the British frigate. Not due for about another 4 or 5 years to be for its design to be completed. But at the cost of 1 British frigate, we can build 10 well-armed corvettes and crew 3.5 of them. So we're getting 9 of those, that's 45 billion, the program. That 45 billion, we could probably do just about everything in Smith and Houston's report. That's going to be an interesting debate, because I'm not sure if the frigate goes, we will have AUKUS. And so that is going to have to be thrashed around by ministers. What is the price of AUKUS? And what does it mean in foregone opportunity in other areas which are probably highly effective?
I will not express a view on frigates for obvious reasons. I'll leave that to the government in due course. But on the broader issue of capability gaps, particularly in the next few years, that is where we need Pillar 2 to step up and those other advanced capabilities to make a meaningful difference in a much shorter time frame, because some of them don't require a shipyard to be built or a steel to be cut, and they can be deployed much more quickly. That offensive cyber that the previous government invested in through the Red Spice program, the Australian Signals Directorate, is all about that. As soon as you can hire and deploy and train those people, you have the capability. And it's an asymmetric capability that can make a much larger adversary think twice about what they might do to you. Obviously, we're not going to win a war in the cyber realm alone. We're going to need other capabilities. But that's why I think there's going to need to be, in the short term, a real emphasis on that second pillar, because unfortunately, the prospects and the forecasts for conflict in our region are coming closer, not going further away. And every time, the 3 trips I went to the US this year, one was in February, one was in September, and one was in October. Every time I went, they revised the timeline down and closer to our current time.
Hello. Tom, New South Wales, University of New South Wales. One of the things, Ambassador Hockey, that I'd like you to just expand on, if you could, is that role of the private sector. And in particular, what does it mean in the context of that enigmatic inclusion of innovation in the second line of lines of endeavour in the AUKUS agenda? Again, it seems to me that innovation in this context, without a muscular role for the private sector, is going to be vacuous. But how do you engineer, because it won't just happen, that private sector engagement in a timely way into the overall innovative agenda in the AUKUS context?
So it's a really good question. So when you set up, and I've never set up a fund. I mean, there's been politicians over the years that have had unlawful funds. There's only one ex-politician that we can find that's ever set up a formal legal fund. So I was raising it in 2020, height of COVID. So normally you have to get a prospectus. It costs you, $1 million to set up a fund. And then you've got to do all the legals, and you've got to have all the vehicles for all the investors overseas, etc. And then you start the pitch. And my pitch was, I can see consistent growth in defence expenditure over the next 20 years. And this is why. And you know what? It's not, traditionally defence expenditure has been outside of war, it's been a lot about personnel, more boots. But actually, there's going to be a hell of a lot of push-button activity in the next engagement. And technology is going to make the difference. And so Australia has a vast number of terrific companies that are niche technology companies. And they come to the United States and they dream of getting just one little contract from the Pentagon. And of course, that doesn't happen 99 times out of 100. And a lot of them don't have revenue. So we said, okay, we only want to invest in companies that have revenue because we can't afford to fail this fund because we are educating a whole new class of investors. These people have never invested in national security before. And I challenge the audience, I don't think there's anyone here who has invested in more than one defence company, probably. So it's really hard to find these investors. So when you're going to billionaires and people with hundreds of millions of dollars, you're saying, you've been making widgets for the last 30 years, it's made you a billionaire. Come and invest in a defence company that you probably don't understand the technology. They go, forget it. I've made my money by investing in widgets. So what we have to do is have a presentable, credible case that this company has money coming in, and importantly, from our perspective, it's got to be dual purpose. So it has a commercial application as well as a military application. If you have a commercial application, a military application, you have revenue and you have markets overseas, then you're right in our framework. But if you don't have any of those, it's a really hard investment proposition. It's a really hard mountain to climb. And we leave that to Main Sequence and InQtel. InQtel is the CIA's investment arm, and Australia's government invests in them and a few others. And we work closely with them, but they go into a lot of companies and take shadow board seats, and they go into companies that aren't making money because they're trying to preserve technology. Main Sequence is next level. We're the next level before, hopefully, we can get them to an IPO, or we can get major hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. We're trying to fill that gap, which gives Australian industry a bit of a step up. Hard to do, but we're getting there. We're on track.
I'm afraid we're out of time. It's obviously a very popular panel and lots of interesting points coming out. But we have another panel starting immediately. So if I can ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for this afternoon. Thank you.